but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, I'm Darren Grimes, standing in for the brilliant Neil Oliver on GB News TV and on radio. Tonight I'll be joined by Professor Ralph Scholhammer to discuss the wider implications of the situation unfolding in Israel. We'll be discussing whether a broader conflict is likely and what the repercussions will be felt here in Europe. And we'll also be taking a look at Harry and Meghan's latest visit to New York City and asking whether it was really necessary for the couple to have a 7-car motorcade to go one block. And with the cost of living continuing to rise, many couples are finding themselves forced to live together despite ending their relationships, as they simply cannot afford to move out and find new homes. We'll be asking a psychologist all about the reality of living in such situations. And the historian Martin Whittock will join me to discuss his new book all about the origins and history of the Vikings. Fascinating stuff. All of that and more coming up. But first, here's an update on the latest news from Aaron Armstrong.
Hi there, very good evening to you. It's 6:01 here in the GB Newsroom. The Israeli Defence Forces has just announced their troops are preparing to expand their operations on the ground in Gaza. It comes shortly after the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, confirmed the next stage of their assault against Hamas is coming. He visited troops stationed near the Gaza Strip, with that ground offensive thought to be imminent. That comes as an extended deadline for Palestinians to flee safely to the south of the enclave passed several hours ago. Tanks and more than 300,000 reservists have been mobilised in the south of the country. Mr Netanyahu has vowed to annihilate the Hamas militant group, which controls Gaza, in retaliation for the deadly attack by its fighters in the south of Israel last weekend. Well, as I mentioned, thousands of Palestinians have been fleeing northern Gaza. That evacuation window has now closed. They, along with foreign nationals, have been heading south towards the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. It's the only route out of Gaza that's not under Israeli control, but has been closed over the last few days because of Israeli airstrikes. The United States says it's working to get that crossing open and has advised its citizens to go there, although a US State Department spokesman has confirmed that the window may only be open for a short amount of time. A young British girl who's trapped in Gaza says she fears for her life.
Like really in fear, and like every time I just have to have the thought of me dying in a bomb in Gaza. Like it's not a good thing. And like every place I go run away, and I just find bombs and I find dead people, and like maybe one day I'll end up like them, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Well, Israel is continuing its total siege of Gaza. Supplies of electricity, food and water have been cut off, and airstrikes are continuing. Hamas says 9 captives, including 4 foreigners, have been killed because of Israeli airstrikes overnight. Hamas is understood to still be holding at least 120 hostages. The amount of people killed in Gaza has risen to at least 2,215. With more than 8,700 wounded, those figures according to the local Palestinian Health Ministry. Meanwhile, the Israeli Defense Forces have been carrying out localized raids into the territory as they search for terrorists and the hostages that they are holding. GB News reporter Charlie Peters has more from Tel Aviv.
As night falls on Gaza and hundreds of thousands of civilians flee south from the north of the Gaza Strip, the IDF prepares to shape the ground for that likely ground invasion in the next 24 to 48 hours. Nobody knows when the Israeli Defense Forces will launch that eventual invasion, but it is imminent. And before they can do that, they need to ensure that as few Hamas military capabilities are available to the opposition. They need to remove anti-tank teams, they need to remove air defence assets, and the way they need to do that is through airstrikes. This is what the IDF have been saying for the last few days as they have launched relentless barrages on the Gaza Strip.
2 charter flights have left Israel as part of a UK government effort to get British nationals out of the country. The Foreign Office say more flights are expected to run in the coming days. Counter-terrorism police in the UK are reviewing 55 new cases of potentially harmful online content amid the ongoing conflict. The Metropolitan Police say there's been a significant number of referrals from the public. The force is encouraging people to report content that appears to incite terrorist violence or activity. The police say they'll also work with tech companies to remove that content that's been judged to breach UK terrorism legislation. France is deploying 7,000 soldiers to increase security after a school teacher was killed and 3 other people were injured. It's been linked to the conflict that's ongoing between Israel and Hamas. France has raised its security alert to the highest level. The suspect's been arrested. Police say he is a Russian-born Chechen and a former student of the high school. And in Paris this morning, the Louvre was evacuated after it received a written threat. Australia has voted no in a controversial referendum to officially recognise Indigenous people in its constitution. More than half of the votes have been counted, and the no vote appears to have 57% of those votes. Australian broadcasters project that at least 4 of the 6 states will vote against altering the 122-year-old constitution. But the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who has championed the plans, says the country must seek a new way forward following the defeat.
At the outset, I want to say that while tonight's result is not one that I had hoped for, I absolutely respect the decision of the Australian people and the democratic process that has delivered it. When we reflect on everything happening in the world today, we can all give thanks that here in Australia we make the big decisions peacefully and as equals, with one vote, one value.
Well, this is GB News on TV, digital radio and on your smart speaker too. That's it from me. And now it's over to Darren.
Thanks, Aaron. Of course, we're broadcasting here from grand old London, known for Big Ben, the Royal Buckingham Palace, and now, alas, for throngs chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. A melody to many Jews in Britain and across the world, as sweet as a hornet's nest. So what's being beckoned on the streets today? A full-scale erasure of Israel? Is that the answer? The butchering of thousands more Israeli citizens for the mere crime of being Jewish? And, of course, the spectacle of Labour Party conference this week was a sight to behold. The middle-class left-wingers touting for their Justice for Palestine stall was right beside the LGBT plus Labour stall. The irony, I doubt, will be lost on many viewers tonight. Have any of these ninnies ever set foot in Palestine, for example? I mean, you declare you're non-binary or fond of the same sex in Gaza, and the only intersectionality you'll be acquainted with has been flattened at an intersection in Gaza City. So why don't these revolutionaries on our streets, screeching to free Palestine, kickstart a crowdfunder? I'm certain that many would happily chip in for a one-way ticket to send them off to their cherished Valhalla of Gaza. I'm absolutely mortified by the scenes unfolding in Britain. It breaks my heart to see. This is a land that I adore. A Batley Grammar School teacher dives into hiding for showcasing a cartoon. Presumably, he's going to be in hiding for some time to come. There was an autistic child threatened over a scuffed Quran, and now Jewish schools are fastening their bolts, quaking at the thought of being next on the list for an anti-Semitic violent crime. Is this the melting pot of cultures that we're peddling here? Calls for the military to shield schools in Britain are actually being seriously suggested. Isn't it high time to admit that we're in quite the quagmire here in Britain, not just in Israel? I mean, it should rankle every Brit that our schools are bolting doors in dread, particularly amidst the spike in vile anti-Semitic incidents of late. I mean, picture the chaos if a different crew was spewing such vile slogans against a minority as diminutive as Britain's Jewish community. Fancy their chances of strolling away scot-free? Because I certainly don't, and rightly so. Now let's broaden the view a smidgen. A French teacher was just stabbed to death in a case President Macron dubbed Islamist terrorism. Russia, China, Iran, they're each scheming to topple the West. Yet here in Britain, we're tongue-tied, unable to utter terrorist when it comes to the BBC's narrative, for example. Hamas, the so-called freedom fighters, a disgusting description in my view, the BBC skirt around. They're the ISIS of Palestine, a retrograde death cult itching to yank us all back to the Dark Ages. So if you consider these blokes freedom fighters, I dare say, endure 2 minutes under their rule and then we'll talk. The harsh reality is that Hamas is no saviour for Palestine. Since commandeering Gaza, they've opted for rocket arsenals over schools, for military tunnels over hospitals, and the goal to use their own as human shields. Does this echo freedom fighters to you? Is this justice? Merely weeks ago, I was in Israel, a nation encircled by foes on each side. Yet here we are, hesitating to actually take a decisive stand and call a spade. Britain ought to assure its Jewish populace, and indeed the world, which side of history it aligns with. These Hamas and Iranian cheerleaders in Britain should be dealt the same frosty treatment were handed those ISIS aficionados. Confiscate their passports, boot their citizenship and show them the exit. The Shamima Begum treatment. Our island isn't a stomping ground for those views. Cheers very much. The last call should have been sounded, and it's about time Britain ceased being a refuge for the mouthpieces of malevolence. And don't get us started on the Football Association. The spineless cowards that they are. They can drench Wembley in Black Lives Matter hues over the appalling end of one man in America, but they can't light up the arch for over 1,300 slain Israelis. What twisted morality is that? So don't be hoodwinked by these factions. What Palestine, what the world craves, is liberation from the wickedness that is Hamas. I don't think that's a topic really ought to be up for debate. It's a stark reality. So let's slice through the gibberish, confront these adversaries of our values, and for the love of God, start calling a spade a spade. Well, all of that is my opinion, of course, and you're free to disagree, so please do keep your tweets and emails coming in throughout the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.com. You can also tweet us at gbnews. I'll try to get to some of your comments later on in the show. I'm delighted to say I'm joined now, though, and throughout the show, by the former advisor to the Labour Party, Scarlett Maguire. Now, Scarlett, as I say, everyone is free to disagree. Did you disagree with that?
I think what Hamas did was a war crime. Absolutely, it was atrocious. It was absolutely inexcusable.
It's been a difficult week, hasn't it?
And people who say, that there were reasons, it's absolutely not. However, I do not think that justifies Israel killing up to now 2,200 Palestinians, most of whom are civilians. They bombed people leaving Gaza after they told Gaza. Two war crimes they don't fit each other. Right. Both of them should be stopped. And what we should be doing is we should be going for peace. Of course, we should utterly, and as frankly 99% of Britain, if not more, have done, utterly condemn those killings. What Hamas did, I'm not sure anybody does call them freedom fighters. I think they call them militant. I think the BBC calls them militants, right? What Hamas did was absolutely inexcusable and terrible, but that doesn't mean that you then can bomb other people.
Yes, but I mean a lot of what we hear is tit for tat. That actually Israel has murdered more than the 1,300 of Israelis that were killed last weekend. Now, can we really argue that, should Israel have gone into Gaza and murdered women, kidnapped old Holocaust survivors, of course, of which there are none, but should the revenge have been exactly the same, Scarlett, as what Israel is what the Hamas perpetrated in Gaza, Israel, for example?
No, but I do not think that means that Israel can cut off the electricity, cut off the food, that they are causing people to die, and then bomb them, and then actually bomb people who are trying to leave, as Israel have told them. Of course, one understands that Israel is hurt and furious, but as Lord William Hague said, right, no apologist for anybody, Israel will fall into the Hamas trap. Hamas wants to cause trouble. I mean, what they did in Israel, they knew that what it would mean is that thousands of Palestinians would die of it. So let's not pretend that Hamas is good for Palestine, right? It is a terrible, terrible force. What happened was absolutely inexcusable, but that doesn't mean that Israel should then kill Palestinians, right? That's all I'm saying.
And what did you think about that particular FA display last night? That's the Football Association, where at Wembley, they basically had a blackout where they had a sign saying that they stand in a moment of solidarity. They stand for peace.
Look, by the time the football match happened, right, over 2,000 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli forces. It was absolutely right that the FA said, we stand for peace. We don't want any Israeli flags. We don't want any Palestinian flags. What we stand for is peace. And actually, that's what we should be trying to get. And that's what we should have been trying to get for the last 50 years. I mean, that is the problem. The problem is what has been going on in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, right? And it's it doesn't help anybody to sort of be cheerleaders on one side to set, because what we need. I mean, this sounds really terrible, but we need negotiation, and that's what I'm hoping the Americans are going to do.
OK, Scarlett. Well, as we say on this show, both sides of the debate, of course. So thank you very much, Scarlett Maguire. There, folks. After the break, we're going to be joined by Professor in Political Science and Economics at Vienna University, Ralph Scholhammer. What a name! To discuss how the conflict in the Middle East could spill into Europe. We'll be back in just a mo.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Well,
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News,
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On Mark Dolan tonight in My Take at 10, a Lloyds Bank boss has condemned the Prime Minister for pointing out there's a difference between a man and a woman. Britain's corporations are now institutionally woke. What utter bankers? Plus, the top rabbi who's resigned from the FA over their Israel starts, Channel 4's Kim Woodburn on the departure of Holly Willoughby from This Morning, and the extraordinary story of the woman who suffers from a rare condition that turns her into a statue. We're live from 9.
Welcome back, I'm Darren Grimes, in for the brilliant Neil Oliver on GB News TV and on radio. Now, we're already seeing the fallout from the Israel-Hamas conflict here in Europe. We've had demonstrations on city streets just today, and the Home Office has drawn up plans to expel foreign students, academics and workers who commit anti-Semitic acts or praise Hamas, which is of course a proscribed terrorist organisation. Similar moves have already been made in France. So to discuss and chew the fat on this, I'm joined now by Professor in Political Science and Economics at Vienna University, Ralph Scholhammer. Ralph, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what do you make of what we've seen on the streets of London today? You've got a fair chunk of people right out on the streets. Do you think this is something that we're going to see more? Are there going to be more calls for this kind of action to combat people being out on the streets after these kinds of acts have been perpetrated?
Well, I think if you look at the immigration policy and the general demographics all over the West, the Muslim population is increasing. Since we have failed in most countries with our efforts of integration and assimilation, it is likely that all the conflicts that take place in the region, in the Middle East, will gradually bleed over into Europe. I think this is unavoidable unless we really change course when it comes to assimilation and integration. So this is a problem that most likely will get worse and not better, because we must not forget, not everybody who sympathizes with Hamas and these views is out in the streets and yells Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas, right? So if those who do it out in the open like this, fine, you can deport them. And let's see how many people will really be deported, because it's not going to be that easy, because many of them, at least in Germany, but I'm sure it's the same in Britain as well, hold citizenships, right? It's not going to be that easy.
What do you say to the argument that argues against what France have done in banning outright, because they would argue that actually sunlight is the best disinfectant, and if you actually hear the views of someone, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. You know, there's this idea that actually it's important to know that these are the views held by a group of British people who've come here and hold these views that most would consider quite abhorrent, but like that chant you've just said there.
I think that is true, and I also think that if people want to voice their opinion in a country that holds free speech dear, they should have the right to do so. But I think we have a tendency to forget what free speech, and you kind of mentioned it in your question, was originally meant to be, like a disinfectant, sunlight. But what we have done in the West, I argue at least, is that these people came here, we had a good sense of what the views were. We have plenty of polls. We recently did one with the university in Austria, for example, so we know that anti-Semitism among the Muslim population, the Arab population, is a very, very strong presence. But nobody ever wants to talk about it, because the attitude is, and we actually I can show this later, right? We wanted to publish this, and the authorities said, do you really have to publish this? Like, let's keep a lid on this whole topic. Because we treat this as kind of, you know, it's just part of the local flavor, right? The Swiss like cheese, and the French like wine, and the Arabs like anti-Semitism. It really is not that much of a difference. So we never really counted them, right? There was never an effort made to say these views are unacceptable. It's only when something happens like now that everybody says, oh, now we have to do something. But I think at some point, right, if this is again just a spark, now for 2, 3, 4 weeks, everybody is very outraged. But then it's going to fade into the background, like everything in the West does, right? 9/11 is now 21 years ago. We never really got a grip on how to deal with Muslim minorities in the West.
I'm just going to bring in the former Labour advisor, Scarlett Maguire, here. Scarlett, do you agree with that sentiment? Do you think we're going to forget about this all too quickly?
No, I don't think we're going to forget about it, but I think it's really important that many, if not most, if not the vast majority of Muslims are not anti-Semitic. I mean, in this country, for a start, most Muslims are not Arab, right? Most Muslims come from Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I think to start talking about a Muslim minority in this way is as dangerous as talking about a Jewish minority. Is that actually, I mean, you know, there's Tell Mama, which is where the Jews have their anti-Semitic thing, which is the CST, the Community Security Trust, and the Muslims have Tell Mama. The anti-Muslim things have risen massively in this week as well. And I think it's very, very important that we don't start talking about groups like that, is that a lot of people on that march would not have been Muslim or let alone Arab, right? There are an awful lot of people in Britain who actually agree with freeing Palestine, but that doesn't mean that they support Hamas.
So, Ralph, listening to what Scarlett said there, and knowing that actually conflicts like this generally do lead to more extremism elsewhere, do we worry for British Jewish people in this country?
Well, before I answer that, can I just have a quick
Of course you can.
Two points. A little bit, I feel like I'm in a time machine, because this is exactly what we heard after 9/11, right? It was always the argument, it's just a very, very small minority. It has nothing to do with the vast majority, and that is true. But I would say something else, and I think this is where the rubber hits the road. If it is the case that, let's say, hypothetically, 98% of all Muslims entirely disagree with Hamas supporters and the position that they take, for example, on the Jews in Israel, I would assume that these 98% of the community have a grip on those 2% who apparently hold positions that none of them shares. But apparently they don't. So there is those who speak openly about it, then there's those who ignore it, and then are those who tentatively and silently agree with them. And we kind of do have the polls about this. I mean, this is what happens, for example, in Egypt, when randomly then somebody shoots up tourists. You had beheadings in the street of France, you had beheadings in the street of London, you had the Ariana Grande thing in Manchester. So I think we always do then say, oh, nobody really wants to do this. Then I have to ask, why does the majority of that community not get that radical minority under control?
Well, actually, after 9/11, there was a lot of work between the Muslim community and the police and the government at the time to talk about. I mean, particularly when people started. Actually, it wasn't 9/11. It was the Syria. It was going to Syria to fight with ISIS, and they got together because what they all agreed with was that young people should not go and fight with ISIS, and they worked together really well. And now, I mean, if you talk to serious counter-terrorism people, the Muslims are not a problem, right? The problem actually at the moment is the far right, and they do not know how to deal with them. So actually, it is not good enough to start saying, oh, these Muslims are a problem. I mean, obviously, people should not be. I mean, you know, I find it abhorrent, somebody who can excuse Hamas for what they did last week, right? Absolutely abhorrent. But you can't write off a community.
Ralph, come back to that point, because we've only got a minute left, so you can come back to that point. But I do, you know, that point on the terror threat, for example, what do you think of the situation in Britain today?
I think that the threat, I mean, has never really disappeared. It is definitely greater than it was in the past. We'll see how this is going to play out. But just a quick thing. For example, the Times of London reported a couple of years ago, more British Muslims joined ISIS than British Muslims joined the British Armed Forces. So I'm not saying the Muslims are the problem, that within the Muslim community, within the community of the Islamic faith, there are certain tendencies, there are certain belief and value systems that are problematic. And I think we have now for 21 years closed our eyes to this. And I have a sense that we're doing it again. We again say, oh, this is just a very, very small number of people. But apparently the number is big enough that Jewish schools, Jewish institutions have to tell their members, don't show in public that you're Jewish. And honestly, in Britain it's different, but in Germany I think it's even more of a problem. Given the history that we have with Jewish communities in Europe, that is abhorrent. That should never have happened again, and it is happening again.
Okie doke. Well, I mean, Scarlett, do you want a quick one line coming back to that?
I just the people who are attacking Jewish communities are completely wrong. But it's not just Arabs. I mean, let's not say it's not just about Muslims, right? That's all I'm saying. And of course, the Jewish community, as should the Muslim community, should be safe, right? That's what we all agree.
Okay. Well, look, Ralph, we're going to have to end it there, but Ralph and Scarlett, thank you very much. That was Ralph Scholhammer. Rolf? I've changed your name 3 times now. At Vienna University, thank you very much for your thoughts. Now, folks, coming up, we have a treat for you, because we're going live to New York for the fallout from Harry and Meghan's latest trip to Manhattan. And we'll have a look at what it really means to be stuck sharing a house with your ex once your relationship has ended. Can't imagine. I'll see you in 3.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the live desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live with me, Darren Grimes. Now, I want to talk to you about this pair, Harry and Meghan. They're really keen to clean up their image and, of course, clean up the environment. But perhaps they need a better PR team because they gave their critics another Orban goal this week when they used gas-guzzling 7-car convoy to take them on a journey around one single block to attend an event in New York City. To discuss this, I'm joined by the New York-based journalist, the award-winning Nelson Aspen. Nelson, thank you very much for your time today. Look, there'll be viewers here in the UK who won't know New York. For their benefit, how far is a single block?
I mean, it would take them less than 2 minutes to walk that distance, but I'm sure she had very high heels on. In fact, I can confirm that she had very high heels on. But yes, you were right. To go to this event for part of the mental wellness in a digital age discussion that they were having, they enlisted 7 SUVs that had blacked out windows, and they also had a New York Police Department escort. So it was quite a parade, and as if Manhattan congestion on the roads isn't bad enough, this further exacerbated it. But they got there safely, and I guess that's the important thing, and no one was able to get a picture of them through the blacked out windows, Darren.
I mean, Nelson, we associate, don't we, visually at least, a motorcade with a presidential candidate or a president in office. We don't associate it perhaps with reality television stars.
Well, it's funny you mentioned politics, and I think that is really Meghan's latest cause célèbre. She's really thrown herself at everything, trying to see what sticks. Oh, I'll write a children's book. Oh, I'll do a podcast. Oh, I'll release a fashion line. She's really trying to find her way. And politics is, I suspect, where she wants to end up. She was very quick to get her photograph taken with political figures. She met Vice President Kamala Harris's husband and made sure there was a photo up there. She does an awful lot of hugging. I think if she wants to be a presidential candidate, she needs to shake more hands and do a little less hugging. But whatever. New Yorkers are not very impressed by celebrities to begin with. Harry's mother, Diana, was an exception when she made her first solo visit here in the late 80s. She really charmed New York City.
Of course.
Harry and Meghan don't have that effect on New Yorkers.
But then if Meghan has these delusions of grandeur to become a political candidate, for example, is there not a certain amount of a faux pas here where actually driving in such a massive motorcade whilst you're also arguing that people need to be greener and cleaner is somewhat hypocritical.
That's Hollywood hypocrisy at its finest. No one is more green than Leonardo DiCaprio, and yet he is constantly on private jets with his model du jour.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, this is going to harm them, isn't it, in America, right? This isn't... The polling, if you look at public polling, the pair aren't as popular as they once were. And, of course, they went to America for the fame and fortune, Julie.
That's correct, and I think that she, and when I'm referring to Meghan here, I don't want to bring Harry into this so much. He really is becoming a bit of a handbag, but Meghan really is a rather, I dare say, a control freak. She always has a list of expectations. One of their visits here to New York, they went to a school in Harlem, and there was a long list of demands that eventually became public of what she expected, and she wanted Meghan and Harry friendly media in attendance. So she does want to control the narrative, and now she's got a new high-powered talent agent in Hollywood, and I'm sure they're trying to guide her, but I think they need to be clearer on what her end game is, because she really does seem to be trying her hand at everything.
Well, Nelson, I can't say it's been money well spent. I don't know about you, but we'll have to leave it there. Nelson, thank you very much for your time today. Now, folks, what I want to talk about next is this really intriguing article that appeared on the Big Issue website this week. Now, this was an issue that was highlighting another consequence of a cost of living crisis. It was discussing single people who've recently broken up with their partners and they're being forced to continue living together simply because they can't afford to move out. Well, I could think of no one better to discuss this than the psychotherapist from Tavistock Relationships, Dr. Marianne O'Connor. Dr. Marianne, thank you very much for your time today. Can I start by asking you, have we had a real insight into what this does to a person from lockdown, for example? I'm sure there were couples that broke up during that period, perhaps seeking divorce and all the rest of it, but were forced to continue living together.
Yes, I think that we have known about couples who divorced with children or who want to divorce with children, and they can't afford to move from the home where their bedroom's enough for the children unless they both sell up and both live in bedsits or both leave their rented accommodation and live in very small places. But I think there's this new phenomenon of young people who may be in a shared house, sharing a room with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and then they break up and they don't have the money for deposit on a new flat. There are very few reasonably priced accommodations available, and they have to not only endure living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, but they have to share a bed. It's very difficult when couples, want to start new lives, want also to forget. If your partner's left you because they found someone else, it's pretty hard to come back to them every evening.
Exactly, and surely this precludes future relationships, because if you go on a date with someone, I assume, and tell them, oh, actually, I still live with my ex, they're going to be saying, well, hang on a minute, I've got alarm bells ringing here.
Well, of course they're going to be suspicious, and also it's very difficult to form a new relationship when you don't have your own bedroom, for example. So it's tough for young people. At Tavistock Relationships, we see people from, different situations, different economic backgrounds, and we see some young people who are attempting to patch up the relationship because it's so difficult to leave one another. In some cases, it's really unsuitable for them to stay together. There may even be a sort of feeling of coercive control, or they want to escape, and they have to rely on the kindness of strangers often in order to find a friend of a friend who can put them up. But it's not easy with the present housing crisis.
Indeed, and this is a problem that's only going to get worse, I'm afraid, right? Because we're not building enough houses and people are struggling like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I can't imagine the number of people in London, for example, looking to move out and find their own place, but are simply precluded from the marketplace from being able to do so.
Yes, there's very little social housing being built anywhere in England at the moment. And in London, it's particularly acute, this problem.
So do you see this getting worse then? Do you see, is there almost an infantilization of the next generation where they're either having to stay home with mother and father or they're having to stay with an ex-partner? It just can't be good for human development, can it, to be in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people who are in this situation are from backgrounds where it's not easy to stay at home with mother and father. There may not be accommodation available at their own home. They may live in a completely different part of the country. It isn't that easy if you've got a parent. People actually regard having a parent who lives in the town as you're working as quite a gift these days. If you get on with them, you can move back. But that isn't the case for most people living in London.
Scarlett Maguire, bringing you in on this, do you think politicians are taking the issue seriously enough, as in housing itself?
Well, they haven't been for decades. I mean, it's just been getting worse and worse. I completely agree with Marion. I mean, you know, for a lot of couples who break up, it has meant and it's normally the man who leaves and goes back to his parents. And I can tell you, knowing many people who suddenly discovered that, you know, their children have come back, it's not good for it's not good for the son, but it's also, I mean, and daughters obviously do it as well, but it's also not great for parents suddenly having a grown up in the house. Yes, I mean, we need to build more houses. We need, as Marion says, we need social housing so that people can afford. I mean, I think they've now discovered that if you live in rented accommodation, that your lifespan is shorter because of the stress, because of everything. And in this case, both the Tories and the Labour, which is why I say 30 years. I mean, it did begin with selling off council houses, and then the worst thing was that the councils were not allowed to use the money to build more housing. We gave away a golden asset. It was appalling. OK, well, yeah, that's another conversation. So I'm sure we'll get onto that during the break. But, Marion, I want to ask you, are there any positives to this? Because divorce rates are going up, and actually breakdowns in family relationships actually mean you harm, basically, a child's development in life. You know, children who live in broken homes are more likely to get into a life of not doing very well at school, have maybe ended up in crime, etc., etc. The stats are pretty clear on that. Is there a positive news story here that says, well, more couples staying together is actually pretty good for society writ large?
If only that was true, that would be great. But actually, I think that people who break up amicably and can be good co-parents, can remain a couple as parents and can talk about their children and work well together. I think the children of those parents who break up do very well indeed. I think the difficulty is that some children are stuck in a very hostile environment where they hear their parents arguing, they feel a sense of anxiety and threat. Not physical threat, but will my parents leave? Will one of them get upset? Will one of them bang the door? It's a constant level of stress that isn't good for children.
Yeah, well, build more homes, folks. I think we all agree on that one. But Marianne O'Connor there, thank you very much for your time of Tavistock relationships, of course, and that was Scarlett Maguire just before there. Now, folks, what we've got coming up after the break, I'll be joined by the amazing historian Martin Whittock to discuss his latest book. It's called American Vikings. I bet you didn't know that. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a mo.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
And Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK. Here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back, folks. I'm still Darren Grimes, and I'm still in for the wonderful Neil Oliver. Now, we're going to ask, where exactly did the Vikings come from? How did they arrive, and what were they actually like? Because my next guest has actually discovered some archaeology and a new book that suggests that actually they got as far as America, can you believe? So, Martin Whittock, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good evening.
How did they end up? Are they the first Yanks, as it were?
Well, the evidence is that they're the first Europeans that made it to America. Of course, Christopher Columbus only got to the Caribbean, bit of Central America, bit of the northern part of South America. But the actual first Europeans that got to America, we are now certain, were Scandinavians who'd come from Greenland.
And in your book, you're talking about, well, we obviously know the influence of the Vikings in Europe, right? It's well documented, etc., etc. You learn that at school in history classes and all the rest of it. But Vikings in North America, it's a nice popular myth, hasn't it, been in America? And you've mentioned some NFL teams which are named the Vikings, the Minnesota Vikings, I believe.
Indeed, that's right.
But they're not, the Vikings didn't get to Minnesota.
No.
But they did get where?
Newfoundland. 2 sagas written in Iceland in the 13th century. Eric the Red Saga, Saga of the Greenlanders, tells this story about people who sailed from Iceland to Greenland and then to a place they called Vinland, which we now know to be North America. For a long time it was thought to be legend, but in the 1960s, archaeological excavations actually turned up at a place called Launceston Meadow in northern Newfoundland, actual evidence from the 11th century. And as late as 2021, the chronological dating of that, the wood that was cut there, said the wood was cut in 1021. So we know they were there in 1021, cutting wood, making their stockade, making their settlement. But the key point is they weren't there for very long. The archaeology was very thin. It clearly was a staging point. There were some things found there, butternuts, which are white walnuts, which come from New England, which suggests that the archaeology for them in Newfoundland is actually a signpost pointing to where they went beyond that. So somewhere there are sites in Newfoundland, in New Brunswick maybe, or in Maine, or maybe Connecticut, where the Vikings will have left more evidence. the hunt is on.
And what was the influence, what was the surviving impact of the Vikings, not just in Europe, but maybe across other places as well? How much did they actually influence who we are today?
Well, they made a big impact on this country. I mean, basically, by the 11th century, this was an Anglo-Scandinavian land. They are among the formative people who created Kiev Rus, you know, the early Russian state, which was a Scandinavian Slavic state based at Kiev or Kiev, which is part of the contested story of Ukraine today. But in North America, it was assumed to be just a legend. But in the 18th century, Americans began to explore what deep story was there as they broke away from Britain, and they began to discover these myths again, these sagas again. In the 19th century, Scandinavians emigrated to North America and began to look for evidence, including fabricating rune stones, which we find, for example, in Minnesota, one found in 1898, because the Vikings have got into the cultural DNA of the USA, this idea of muscular, strong adventurers, and we even find a guy covered with Viking tattoos, the guy with the horned helmet at the Capitol on January the 6th. Everyone looks at the horned helmet, the horned hat. Nobody looks at the body, covered with Viking tattoos. Now picked up also by the alt-right in America, this idea of muscular white settlers.
Right.
So everything from Marvel comics, you know, through to Viking merch, through to January the 6th. American Vikings are still there. The journey isn't over.
So how many history books have you written so far?
This is my 56th.
And what motivates you to do it?
I love engaging with the past and exploring something of our deep stories, the things that help explain the people we are today.
And what about the Vikings in particular?
I find the Vikings...
You like the hats?
Yeah, no horns.
Right.
No horns. No, sorry, I'm really sorry.
Oh.
So not a single horned helmet found, not a single winged helmet found. In Scandinavia, there are carvings and paintings of beings with horned and winged helmets, which were clearly gods or deities. People assumed they were warriors. It's quite clear they did not have horned helmets. In fact, if you were striking someone with a sword, the last thing you want is your blade, well, the thing you might want is your blade to catch on their horned helmet. They don't want your blade to catch on their horned helmet. It's got to glance off their heads. So we must put the horned helmets behind. No horned helmets.
I mean, Scarlett, are you as distressed as I am to learn that actually this entire mythological image that we've drawn up in our heads of Vikings is all wrong?
I know, and the next thing you're going to be saying is they didn't come over in these beautiful ships.
Oh, the ships are good.
Good.
The ships
Good.
I will not steal anybody's long ship, you know?
Right.
But actually, Viking was something you did rather than who you were. Technically, we should call them the Norse. If you went Viking, it was a bit of muscular free enterprise, although the people at the receiving end tended to describe it in slightly more negative terms. But we tend to say Viking now for all the people of the Viking age, but actually we should technically call them the Norse. But Vikings is the label, we use it all the time now. But they were violent. I mean, you know, things like, you know, Eric Bloodaxe wasn't called that because he was good with the children. You know, Thorfinn's skull splitter on Orkney. These are people you'd not want to mess with on Saturday night.
But there must be lots and lots of Viking... I mean, they must have... Well, they raped lots of women, right? And maybe not always rape, but actually there must be lots of Viking children. I mean, we must be part Viking.
The key thing is the period of raiding soon turned to a period of settlement.
Right.
And then we find people coming over who are not technically Vikings, i.e. they're not warriors, they're not coming to raid and attack. They are men and women, they're farmers, all across Lincolnshire, East Anglia, Yorkshire. The Vikings are there and they're in the DNA today.
In my experience, I always go back to St. Bede and the way in which he was chased after by the Vikings and all the rest of it. So it goes back
He
some
was actually
time.
the previous generation, but they would have chased him if they caught him.
Well,
chased him if they caught him.
See, more Viking myths dismissed.
Sorry.
Martin, thank you very much. And I hope people check out the latest book because that is fascinating stuff already. Martin Whittock there, and of course, Scarlett Maguire before him. That's all from me on Neil Oliver Live for this week. You'll be delighted to learn that Neil is back in his chair next Saturday. Cheers very much. I'll see you for the Saturday 5 next.